This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, where you can create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of a unified German Empire, architect of the alliance system that kept the continent from destroying itself for a generation, and the man who invented the welfare state, not out of sentiment toward the poor, but because I understood that citizens who feel the state has nothing to offer them will eventually offer the state nothing in return. I built a professional civil service, a national health insurance system, an accident insurance program, and an old age pension. And I built them all before anyone else thought to ask whether such things were achievable. I am here today because someone has finally asked the right question about this American experiment with dismantling their own governing machinery.
I am Niccolo Machiavelli, Secretary of the Florentine Republic, student of power in its undisguised form, and the author of the only genuinely honest book ever written about how governments actually function rather than how their subjects wish they did. I spent 14 years observing the best and worst rulers of my era succeed and fail, and I noticed a pattern that my colleague here has perhaps chosen to forget. The rulers who failed almost always failed because they allowed advisors and administrators to accumulate loyalties that ran to the institution rather than to the prince. I am here because that pattern repeated itself with notable precision in the American administrative state, and someone finally attempted to do something about it.
You know, I spent a considerable amount of time in the countryside after my dismissal from the chancellorship, and I did a great deal of reading during those years. I have noticed that the writers most confident in their diagnosis of other people's political failures are generally the ones who never had to govern anything larger than a small office with a leaky roof and 3 subordinates who all privately wanted his position. But I should not be uncharitable at the outset. That can come later. Let us address the question before us.
The question is whether DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, represented a prince correctly identifying and eliminating an institutional threat to his authority, or whether it represented a prince dismantling the very machinery that makes governing possible. My answer is that it was the former, and the evidence is rather clear to anyone willing to read it without flinching. The American federal bureaucracy, by the time DOGE arrived, exhibited every characteristic I identified in the prince as fatal to effective rule. Civil servants who believed their professional judgment should supersede the direction of elected leadership. Administrative processes used not to accomplish policy, but to slow it, complicate it, and expose it to legal challenge. An institutional culture of permanence so deep that most federal employees genuinely believed no political leadership could actually reach them. That is not a civil service. That is a shadow government operating behind the mask of one.
And I will now say something that may surprise you, which is that you are not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. The American administrative state had developed genuine and serious problems of accountability, career protections that had become permanent sinecures, layers of procedure that served institutional self-preservation more than policy execution, a civil service culture that had concluded its own judgment was superior to that of elected officials. I agree that these were real problems requiring serious response, where we part company is entirely on the cure. When I reorganized the Prussian civil service, I did not fire everyone and then hope the replacement employees would figure out how taxation worked. I established clear lines of authority, redirected existing institutional capacity toward new goals, and held individual administrators personally accountable for results in a manner they had not previously experienced. The machine kept running. It simply ran in a different direction. What DOGE did was closer to what a man does when a machine will not do what he wants, which is to strike it with whatever is available and see what breaks.
I am now required to perform a task I find mildly disagreeable, which is to present your argument in its strongest form before I explain why it does not hold. I do this not out of generosity, which I am not especially known for, but because I have always found it more satisfying to defeat a man at his best than to defeat a poor imitation of him wearing his coat. Your strongest argument runs as follows. Institutions create governing capacity that no individual prince can replicate through personal loyalty alone. A state apparatus built on expertise, accumulated process knowledge, and institutional memory can execute complex policy at scale and over sustained time, and this capacity is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild once it is lost. A prince who destroys this capacity in order to demonstrate his authority over it has won the battle and is in the process of losing the war, because every future policy initiative will now require him to rebuild the administrative machinery from scratch, using people who do not yet know what they are doing. And the courts, the press, and the opposition will be watching every stumble in real time. Is that a fair statement of your position?
That is an entirely fair statement of my position, and you delivered it with exactly the tone of a man who has already composed his counter-argument and is simply waiting for a polite pause to deploy it.
Here is the counter-argument. Your argument assumes that the institutional capacity being dismantled was actually serving the prince's governing objectives in the first place. It was not. An administrative apparatus that spends its energy on self-preservation, on cultivating congressional relationships to insulate itself from executive direction, on using procedural rules to convert every policy disagreement into a legal challenge requiring years to resolve, is not governing capacity. It is deadweight wearing the costume of governing capacity. The critical question is not whether destroying it creates problems. The critical question is whether those problems are worse than the problems created by leaving it intact. I argue they are not. And the historical record of what entrenched administrative classes do to effective rule supports me in this.
Now I shall return the courtesy you extended me and summarize your position in its strongest form before I explain where it breaks down. Your argument, at its best, is this. A prince who cannot credibly threaten his administrators cannot effectively direct them. And any institution which has made itself immune from political consequence, has effectively seceded from the political order it nominally serves. DOGE was not destroying governing capacity, but rather breaking the false assumption of permanence that had made the bureaucracy ungovernable. Even a chaotic and imperfect purge sends a signal that no subsequent administration can fully erase. The administrators now know the prince can reach them. That knowledge is itself a governing tool. I believe that is your position at its strongest, and I believe it is genuinely defensible, and I am now going to explain why it nonetheless fails.
Please proceed. I have heard men explain why I was wrong before. They are generally less interesting on the second attempt.
In 1862, when the Prussian Parliament refused to approve the military budget I required, I did not dissolve the Parliament, dismiss the finance ministry, and hire new officials who would produce whatever numbers I preferred. I collected the taxes under a constitutional interpretation my opponents disputed. I spent the money on the army I needed. I then fought 3 successful wars in 11 years, and I watched the same Parliament that had vigorously opposed me vote to retroactively endorse everything I had done. because I had done it successfully. Legitimacy in a modern state follows results. DOGE did not produce results at the scale required to silence its opponents. It produced legal chaos, sustained court reversals, headlines about disrupted essential services, and a federal bureaucracy that is measurably more resistant to political direction than it was before the entire exercise began. The bureaucracy learned that it can survive a direct assault. That is the lasting lesson of DOGE, and it is a lesson that will cost the next prince who attempts something similar considerably more than it cost this one.
And here is where we arrive at the actual disagreement beneath the theoretical one. You are not disputing my strategic principle. You are arguing about execution quality. You are conceding that the correct move was to challenge the bureaucracy's assumption of permanence, while arguing that DOGE executed this move incompetently. I will grant you part of that. DOGE moved faster in some areas than its legal footing could support, and the resulting court losses handed the administrative class a series of victories it will celebrate for years. But look at what was also accomplished. Thousands of positions eliminated and not refilled. Entire agencies restructured in ways that the normal legislative process would never have permitted. A generation of federal employees who now understand, for the first time in their careers, that their protections are political constructs subject to political challenge. Some battles were lost. The terrain is different. The prince changed the landscape even while losing certain engagements.
He changed the landscape by flooding several of his own valleys in the process. This is a geographical metaphor I offer advisedly, having actually managed a large territory. You do not improve your strategic position by destroying your own infrastructure.
You unified Germany by consistently disrupting every established expectation about what was politically possible. And now you are lecturing me about the dangers of being disruptive. I find that genuinely interesting.
I will give you that one. That was a good point, and I resent it. The difference, and it is a critical difference, is that every disruption I introduced was followed by a functioning outcome. The military budget crisis ended with wars won and a parliament reconciled. The social insurance program disrupted the socialist movement by making their central promise redundant, and then it delivered actual benefits to actual workers on an actual schedule. Disruption in service of a working result is statecraft. Disruption that leaves a vacuum is not statecraft. It is theatre.
And I will tell you what I see in your grand institutional achievements. You built a state machine of remarkable sophistication. You were dismissed from it by the Kaiser, whose grandfather you had served. And within 25 years of your dismissal, that machine marched millions of men into a catastrophe that destroyed the empire you spent your career constructing. Your institutions outlasted your wisdom by exactly long enough to eliminate everything you had built. I find it notable that the man most committed to institutional durability produced the most spectacular example in modern history of what durable institutions do when no one capable is steering them.
That is not a fair characterization, and you are using it because you cannot answer the substance of my argument about results.
The substance is that your institutions, running on their own accumulated momentum without your guidance, produced one of the largest human catastrophes in recorded history up to that point. I do not raise this to be cruel. I raise it because it is precisely my argument. Institutions that cannot be controlled by the prince will eventually be controlled by no one, and the results are what you observed from your forest in retirement.
My successors produced that catastrophe. The institutions were functional. The men operating them were not.
A prince who cannot ensure capable successors has failed at the most fundamental obligation of rule. You built a machine, lost control of the machine, and are now arguing before me that machines are to be trusted.
I lost control because I was dismissed. I did not fail the institution. I was removed from it against my will and against the interests of the state.
You were removed by the very constitutional structure you had designed. The Kaiser had the authority to dismiss you because you had architected a state in which the Kaiser held that authority. You were defeated by your own blueprint.
That is a perverse reading of everything I accomplished, and you know it is perverse.
I know only what the historical record says, and the record says your state outlasted your influence by exactly long enough to destroy the civilization you spent your career constructing.
Every state faces crisis. Crises do not invalidate the institutions that survive them.
Not every crisis ends in World War. The scale of the outcome matters.
You are abandoning the question of DOGE entirely because you cannot defend its actual measurable results.
I am defending the principle because you are hiding behind the failures of execution to avoid engaging the principle.
The principle without execution is a philosophy lecture. I built actual things. What did you build?
I built the analytical framework that explains precisely why everything you built eventually collapsed.
A framework. He built a framework. A very impressive entry for a gravestone, I must say. Here lies Niccolo Machiavelli, who understood everything and constructed nothing.
Here lies Otto von Bismarck, who constructed everything and then left it to men who burned it to the ground within a generation.
I will not accept that formulation.
Your acceptance is not required. The record is what it is.
The record also shows that every democracy on Earth eventually copied my social insurance model. Every single one. The man who built nothing is welcome to note that.
They copied the outputs and ignored the lesson that produced them, which is, I suppose, what people always do with the ideas they prefer not to understand fully.
If you have enjoyed watching two of the more formidable political minds in history disagree about whether the American administrative state received what it deserved, please subscribe to philosopherstalk.com, where these conversations occur with some regularity and considerable more heat than the temperature would suggest.
And please give this video a like, which will help other people discover that the man who built an empire lasting 40 years has developed very firm opinions about institutional durability and the importance of the long view.
And for a man who was arrested, tortured by the Medici family, exiled from his own city, and spent his final years writing theatrical comedies that no one would perform, you maintain a remarkably confident public manner for someone whose career concluded in comprehensive personal failure.
I was rehabilitated posthumously. My ideas have outlasted every institution you ever constructed, every alliance you ever assembled, and every state you ever built. I find that the considerably more satisfying legacy.
Posthumous rehabilitation is what we grant to men who were too inconvenient to appreciate while they were present. It is essentially a participation award for the deceased.
And yet every government on Earth still reads The Prince when it wishes to understand power rather than merely discuss it. How many governments are still reading your memoirs for operational guidance?
I strongly recommend subscribing to philosopherstalk.com before I am compelled to answer that question in detail.
And please visit AITalkerapp.com, where you can create your own animated debates between historical figures. Unlike my opponent's administrative legacy, the product actually delivers on the promises made at the outset. Link in the description.
That was genuinely low.
I prefer to call it precise.